Chapter 6. Silver. Lost? Fletch echoed. Then he grinned. Not eternally, I hope. Are you here to guide me, or are you lost too? The boy cocked his head to one side. His pale hair was long and unruly, and his gaze seemed to measure Fletch with a degree of uncertainty. That depends on where you're trying to get to. How about third period English? I know the way. Follow me. He set off down the hall, and Fletch struggled to keep beside him in the press. You are new this year, aren't you? The boy asked. Yes, I'm Fletch Forrester. Happy to meet you. Forrester. That's right. My father's the new pastor at Assembly Chapel. The boy looked at him with interest. I thought that's who you might be. I'm Silver Kendall. I know, Fletch said. I've heard of you. Really? He seemed genuinely surprised. From Betsy Weathers. She goes to our church. Silver stopped and looked at him. I'm from Assembly, but I haven't been to church in a while. It was Betsy who told me about you. She said you liked the forest. Fletch nodded. I'm just getting to know it, really. I wish I had more time to explore, but now there's school. Yes, it's too bad. After class, they ate lunch together, and then they went out onto the breezeway to kill time before the next period. Fletch's preconceptions about Silver did not die easily, and he kept watching for the creature of the woods to break through. There was definitely a magnetism about him. He had the casual affability that in an earlier day would have been called charm, but his pale hair and dark skin made him look a great deal less than tame. No one else was on the breezeway, but Silver had suggested they go there, and Fletch assumed it was permitted. They sat propped against the brick wall, their legs stretched out across the shady concrete walk. Fletch had brought an apple from the lunchroom and began cutting it up with one of the blunt table knives. Silver took the piece Fletch handed him and bit into it solemnly. He looked human enough, but Fletch was still unsure, so he sat there feeding him slices of apple, as if he were a wild animal that had to be approached cautiously with offerings. I was thinking about going for a hike after school, Fletch said. Do you want to come? Where are you going? I don't know exactly. There's a logging road that begins near the church. We could follow that. Silver regarded him for a moment as if sizing him up. All right, he said at last. Why don't you ride home with me? We'll tell my mother what's going on, and then we can head on over to your place. That'll get you home earlier than the bus, and we'll have more time. You live at the pastorium, right? At that moment, the door to the breezeway opened, and a barrel-shaped man came striding out. He looked at them, then checked his watch. Where are you two supposed to be? Fletch's heart sank. It was only the first day, and already he was in trouble. Silver didn't seem at all disturbed. I've heard that's the secret of life, Mr. Barfield, he said amiably. To know one's place and to be in it. We're just in high school. How are we supposed to know the answer to such a question? Mr. Barfield frowned, looking like a perplexed bulldog. You're Silver Kendall, aren't you? He said warily. Silver stood up. Yes, sir, and this is Fletch Forrester. He's new this year. Fletch got to his feet and extended his hand. Mr. Barfield shook it and nodded politely. Then the bell rang, and they escaped into the hall. He's new, too, Silver whispered, and seems to be easily distracted. Silver drove an old gray pickup, having turned 16 in May. He had 8 tracks scattered all over the seat of the truck. The Statler Brothers, Led Zeppelin, Talking Heads. He swept them onto the floor to join a pile of science fiction paperbacks and a half-empty bottle of Mountain Dew. On the way to his house, they finished off the soft drink and listened as Johnny Cash described how he had built a psychobilly Cadillac, one piece at a time. The Kendalls lived about 3 miles from the church, in a log house at the end of a rutted drive. Silver opened the back door and went into the kitchen. The cabin was dark, and no one seemed to be at home. He dropped his knapsack by the door. "My mother must be up at the studio," he said. "Come on." At the back of the house, a path ran along a low stone wall, then zigzagged up a wooded hill to a clear area overlooking a steep ravine. A one-room building grew from the hillside, its sliding glass doors facing north over the little valley. Vibrant music poured from the windows. "This is fantastic," Fletch exclaimed. "It looks just like the mountains." "That's what my grandparents thought," Silver replied. "That's why they chose this spot to build when they came down from Ocala." They went into the studio and found Silver's mother dressed in a paint-spattered t-shirt, working on a canvas the size of a trampoline. The music roaring from the speakers was deafening. Elizabeth Kendall turned and smiled, then looked at Fletch in surprise. She was younger than he had expected, and her features were striking. She looked very much like Silver, but her hair was raven black. "This is Fletch Forrester," Silver told her, "the new preacher's son." Silver's mother turned down the stereo and came over, wiping her hands on a mottled rag that reeked of turpentine. "That music was Mahler, wasn't it?" Fletch asked. She looked surprised. "Second Symphony. You like Mahler?" He nodded. "I have the first and third at home, but I've never heard that one." She gestured toward the canvas. "There's a choral passage in the last movement I'm working from. What has come to life must die. What has died must rise again." The painting was filled with somber silver grays. Portions of it resembled storm clouds, edged with crimson and gold. They spiraled toward the center of the canvas, where light transfigured them and sent them spinning back. Elizabeth Kendall shook her head and smiled wearily. "The dying part works okay, but I'm not sure I like the look of whatever's coming back." "Fletch and I thought we'd go for a hike," Silver told her. "I figure on being back around 6:30, if that's okay." "Fine." She waved them out of the studio. "Nice to meet you, Fletch." Mark Forrester was home when they reached the pastorium, and he seemed pleased with Silver. Fletch knew his father was convinced he was too much of a loner. Anchorite was the word he used, and was glad he had made friends with someone close by. Mark remembered Silver's grandparents, but had never really known Elizabeth Kendall, who had just reached her teens when he had left for seminary. "She knows you from your books," Silver informed him. "She was impressed with the one on Christian socialist communities, though I can't say I've read it myself." Mark gave a rueful smile. "Not many people have. Your mother must be one of about 3 folks who actually bought it." "I think she got it at the Salvation Army," said Silver with a grin. Mark looked pained. "Oh, no, I can see it. On a shelf in the back corner, right? Behind all those coffee cups from Myrtle Beach, right between 6 copies of Love Story and the late great Planet Earth." Fletch and Silver left Mark to his misery. It was good to get back into the woods. The grassy logging road was thick with tiny asters, and the forest smelled richly of rosin and pine needles. Silver noticed everything: the mottled gray lizard that scooted up the trunk of a pine, the waxy nodules on the same tree that marked the infestation of beetles. Finally, Fletch found something he had overlooked. "Silver, look at this." He pulled away a mass of honeysuckle, revealing a tumbled pile of mortared stones. Silver bent and picked one of them up. "Looks like it may have been a chimney." "There's another pile of rocks over here. Maybe some hermit lived out here." "Could be," Silver said, "but to tell you the truth, I suspect this logging trail was once the main road through Assembly." "How do you figure that?" "Betsy has a map that shows where the old wagon roads used to be before the government began building highways. A long time ago, the houses used to go out in this direction rather than over towards the railroad." Foraging deeper into the bushes, they found a large portion of the chimney still intact. Fletch shifted aside some of the rubble, then jumped back with a shout. He had just uncovered one of the biggest snakes he had ever seen. Silver leaped toward him through the undergrowth, and they regarded the snake from a respectful distance. "Look at those patterns," he said softly. "It's a copperhead, all right, a big one, and he ain't happy." He uprooted a tall frond and stripped the leaves from it, then crouched down on the ground. "I'll show you how to apologize to a snake. I learned this from my grandfather." "What are you going to do?" "Just watch, and think nice thoughts about the snake. Tell him you're sorry for disturbing him. Tell him how beautiful he is." Silver gently lowered the frond toward the copperhead and touched it lightly. The snake instantly drew up, preparing to strike. After a minute, Silver again touched it lightly with the frond. Eventually, to Fletch's amazement, the snake grew tolerant of the light touches and relaxed its position. Silver moved slowly over to it. The copperhead coiled up again, but did not retreat, and Silver sat down not far from it. For Fletch, the show had gone too far. His heart was beating not like a drum, but like a tambourine, each reverberation ringing in his ears with a high-pitched jingle. Silver was within striking distance, and the snake looked ready to strike. Very slowly, he extended his right hand. The snake's head came forward just as slowly, as if an invisible string were drawing them both together at the same speed. Silver passed his hand along the snake's wide head and caressed its back. Then he drew back and sat still until the snake began to slither away. At last he got up and came over. "I have never seen anything like that," Fletch told him. "Let me look at your hand." Silver held it out, and Fletch inspected it with as much caution as Silver had used in touching the copperhead. He couldn't sense any special difference in his touch, other than that his palm was warm and dry. His own hands were clammy with sweat. "Is it sort of like what those religious snake handlers do up in the mountains?" Silver considered this. "It's something like that, I guess. I don't have any control over what the snake will do, but I can tell before I put my hand out that he won't strike me." Showing off had probably been part of Silver's intent, but Fletch realized he was also trusting him with a mystery. He felt a touch of envy. "I wish I could get to know the forest better," he said. "Whenever I go out in the woods, I get the suspicion that the possums and coons are laughing at me behind my back. They know I'm domesticated, that I'm only pretending to be wild." Silver cracked a smile. "You look pretty wild to me, unusual anyway. I've been meaning to ask, are your folks foreign?" Fletch shifted uncomfortably, but decided to give him a straight answer. "Well, my grandparents are English, but do you know what an octoroon is?" "I'm not sure. Someone from the islands, like a Polynesian? Or maybe from the Caribbean?" Fletch shook his head. "It's an old word from the slave trade. An octoroon was someone who was mostly white, but had a great-grandparent who was black. I really think of myself as white, I guess, but if I'd lived back then, I could have been sold as a slave." Silver's gaze softened. "Some people are still pretty racist. I kind of know where you're coming from. To some folks, I'm just a half-breed Cherokee. My father was white, but I never knew him. He skipped town when my mother got pregnant." He shrugged. "It's just as well. Mom says if he'd stayed, she would have ended up throwing his ass under a train." Fletch smiled. "I wouldn't put it past her. She strikes me as somebody you wouldn't want to cross when she was riled." "You got that right. We butt heads over everything, but I love her." Silver pushed his hands into the pockets of his jeans. "It was my grandfather who really took the time to teach me about the woods. He'd probably tell you that you can't expect to just blunder into the forest and instantly fit in." He scuffed at the rubble of the chimney with the toe of his sneaker. "Look at these stones. Once they were part of a neat little cabin in a neat little village. Now they're as much a part of the woods as that old copperhead, and they didn't do anything. They just sat there while nature took them over. It took time, but the forest did all the work. So I should find a spot and sit down and let the honeysuckle climb over me? Fletch asked. I reckon that's as good a way as any. But while you're sitting there, you ought to keep your eyes open. Every afternoon during the first week of school, Fletch explored a new branch of the logging trails, and sometimes Silver came along. The more he got to know him, the better he liked him, but Silver also frightened him a little. He was compassionate, yet completely untamed, at once righteous and lawless, definitely unsafe. He had an intensity of presence, a sort of spiritual solidity that Fletch lacked. Part of it was the way he moved, a certain lift of his hand or the way he turned to speak with someone who approached him from behind. One thing Fletch found strange was that Silver seemed to have no close friends. Far from being aloof, he often went out of his way to be kind, and people genuinely liked him, but they treated him with deference. One morning, as Fletch was sorting through his locker, his arm was suddenly jerked down and pinned behind his back. He twisted around in anger, confronting a boy named Dwight Wills, his thin face draped in a parted curtain of oily hair. Before he had time to think, he was spun around, tripped, and slammed into the door of the locker. By the time he had regained his feet, Dwight had vanished. Fletch had been in a number of fights in Atlanta, but now he thought of them as childish. Still, he knew if he didn't stand up to Dwight early on, the situation would only get worse. Most people avoided the boy, and for the time being, Fletch chose to do the same. Dwight was a minimal threat compared with the wicked old wolf who returned that night to trouble his sleep. Fletch was on one of the clearer logging roads, riding an inflatable yellow motorcycle which belonged to the singer Bob Dylan. Motorcycle was the way Dylan had pronounced it. He had given it to Fletch with a warning that it wouldn't hold air, and sure enough, it began to leak almost immediately. He found himself stranded deep in the forest, dragging it along behind him because he was reluctant to give it up. The hard red clay lay empty in either direction, but Fletch suspected the wolf was nearby, perhaps slinking through the shadows on the ridge above the trail. Coming upon a low place where the clay was damp, he saw wolf tracks in the mud, and discovered that the wolf's 4 feet bore the 4 symbols on the stones in the weed garden. Moisture oozed from the prints, resembling blood more than water. Fletch knew the wolf would be angered by his discovery of the symbols, and would try to kill him if he could. Fletch left the deflated motorcycle in the weeds and quickened his pace, hoping to make it to safety before the wolf found out he was there. The road narrowed into a steep ledge, skirting a wall of rock. The shadow of the rock became the wolf's head, and as the green eyes opened, Fletch knew he had been found. He took off, leaping over the ruts in the road, his feet skimming a few inches above the earth, as if he were half flying through the forest. He broke free of the trees at the lower end of the orchard, but knew he would never reach the house. Even the barn was too far away to offer any refuge. There was only one chance of escape. 3 bounds took him to the orchard well. In a flash he had torn away the covering and scrambled up onto the rim. Below, a series of iron rungs led down into the narrow throat of the well. 5 rungs, he counted as he descended, then 10, then 20. After that he lost count. Above, a single green eye peered down into the blackness, and Fletch clung tightly to the rungs, gripped by the sensation that if he lost his hold, he would fall up the shaft of the well, straight into the wolf's gaping jaws. There was no water at the bottom of the well. Instead, he set foot on a floor of stone, and when he turned, he found himself at the edge of a vast vaulted chamber, like the undercroft of a great cathedral. It was very quiet, and nothing seemed to move. The place wasn't dank, but smelled of fresh cedar and fennel. Tall shelves stood along the walls, lined with rows of glass bottles. At the far end of the room stood a young man dressed in a green robe with a belt of woven leaves. His skin was extremely dark, like that of someone from Africa, yet his hair was pale, and he had a strange, almost feral beauty. His almond-shaped eyes were not black, but green. "Who are you?" Fletch asked, or thought he asked. "A friend of a friend. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. That name has followed me." The man held a silver cup, and Fletch knew intuitively that the cup was also a word. Kindred. The cup tilted, and a cascade of acorns tumbled onto the floor. "I know what this means," Fletch said. "We're all nuts." The young man began to laugh, and the laughter got away from him and began booming around inside the chamber, getting louder and louder until it split the dream wide open, and Fletch came awake to crashing thunder and the jubilant pounding of rain. Whiskey. Elizabeth Kendall cleaned her brushes and capped her paints. Though the glass doors were open, the smell of turpentine was thick in the room. Sometimes exhaustion led her to make mistakes, and it was better to step away from the canvas and do something else for an hour or two. Supper was over, and Silver was down at the cabin finishing his homework. Their old cat, Shakanoke, had accompanied Liz back to the studio and was grooming himself on the stone wall, while Liz lost herself in shapes of smoke and mist. Fondly she scratched the cat under the chin. He was almost as old as Silver, and his name came from the way Silver had pronounced chocolate milk when he was 3. Liz sometimes wondered why she remained in Assembly, rather than returning to Oak Hollow, where she still had relatives. Silver had been happy here, but soon he would want to know more about his own people. While there was much he could learn on his own, having an extended family would make things easier. But there was Betsy to consider. Liz and Silver were devoted to her, and Betsy loved them. Liz put on a record of Delius's Hazan and poured herself a small glass of Irish whiskey. Lots of people know Mozart and Beethoven, she thought absently. Of those, most know Mahler and Grieg, and some of those know Bartók in Ireland. But who the hell knows Delius? She had never heard of him herself until a year ago, never run across him, never heard him mentioned in conversation or on national public radio. Most of the recordings she'd found were from the 1950s. The alcohol was easing its way through her fingers and toes when suddenly the record made a dragging sound, as if someone had placed a finger on the turntable. Put it down. She couldn't say she heard the words distinctly, but they had the quality of a command. She looked at the glass of pale gold liquid, less than half a glass, considerably less, but difficult to abandon. Liz had been drinking more frequently in the evenings as she sat on the studio terrace and watched the night descend. It hadn't worried her. She hadn't even thought much about it until now. Raising the glass to her lips, she sniffed. Potent and calming, it beckoned. Put the glass down. Elizabeth Kendall was, in the end, superstitious. She put the glass down. She scanned the room behind her, the corners of the studio where the shelves vanished into shadow. She looked at the places where the ceiling met the walls and waited. Whatever was making the request had better come up with something further, give her a reason to continue to pay attention, and it had better be reasonably quick. "Come on, I don't have all night," she said aloud. Already she felt herself growing slightly angry. Looking out over the terrace wall, she forced herself to be patient. A bird called from the forest beyond. The recording of Hassan continued. "My life is slowly passing," she thought. "This is an hour that will not come again." Dear, 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 the bird trilled in the trees. Liz could smell rain in the soft air moving through the leaves. She took a sip of her drink, swallowed. It was bitter at the back of her throat. She rested her head against the back of the chair and closed her eyes. Only two things were present now, the heat of the whiskey and the sounds out of doors. Somewhere out of reach was an ache in her heart, but it was distant, remote. Why worry about it? Why fret? Day would follow day. For tonight at least the thing she feared would come no closer, and the thing she loved most deeply in all the world would slip no further away. What do you want with him? Betsy stood among the brambles and remembered the same field long ago, and the men gathered there, filled with rage, their hate more sharp than thorns. She remembered the tar baby, a lifeless girl completely covered in black mud. She heard the sobbing of the women, saw the stone faces of the men, and felt again the sickening horror that had filled her, and the terrible helplessness which had threatened to suffocate her. Brer Fox, he wink his eye slow and lay low, and the tar baby she ain't saying nothing. Betsy grasped the briars and pulled. Thorns bit deep and sliced long furrows from elbows to wrists. Her arms ran red with blood, and she screamed. Her mother caught her and held her, trying to shield her from the muddy black thing lying in the field. What happened to her? Mama, what's wrong with Nellie? In childhood, Betsy began to imagine that her dead sister was close to her, physically present and aware. Betsy sometimes sang to her, and Nellie listened, or they would play marbles, jacks, or mumbledy-peg. She had never been secretive about this, but as she grew older she realized it was just as well that no one had ever asked many questions about Nellie. She's black and sticky and doesn't breathe. Her eyes don't ever move. She smells bad. Nellie can't walk, but she latches onto people, and that's how she gets around. It was perplexing. After so many years, only now had Betsy begun to be afraid of her sister. Nellie no longer listened when she sang. Only once, when the mumbledy-peg knife had cut Betsy's bare foot, had Nellie shown any interest at all. Most often now she was turned sideways, leaning slightly, as if drawn by something across the pasture in the direction of the old Nelm's barn, or the church and pastorium beyond it. What do you want with him? He's innocent, Nellie. He had nothing to do with any of that business. This was not altogether true, Betsy knew. Not for a creature like Nellie, for whom time had little meaning. Besides, the thing to which she was bound undoubtedly had purposes of its own. Betsy stretched out her hands, and it was as if eyes opened in her palms. She looked beyond the field to the forest, and through the forest to the swamp, searching. What is that fool Cotton doing out there? Do you know? Her sister ignored her. Her mouth was open, a thing Betsy had never seen before and found she didn't like. Tar baby ain't saying nothing, and Brer Fox, he lay low.